Daily Telegraph Future Sydney Bradfield Oration. Next up is the New South Wales opposition leader Chris Minns, who'll be showing you his address as well. We do know that this is a significant event. It's in its 9th year, celebrating the legacy of the visionary Australian engineer, Dr. John Bradfield. Let's listen in to Chris Minns.
The Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the Premier of New South Wales, Dominic Perrottet, acknowledge the editor of the Daily Telegraph, Ben English, Michael, Robert and Catherine as well, who gave a wonderful keynote address. Thank you so much. It was well delivered. And you notice at the very end, she said, Sydney, the best city in the world, which I imagine is a pretty difficult thing to say when you're the member for Bendigo. Perhaps Albo's staff chucked that in the final draft, Catherine. Friends, the 17th of October 1917 is a landmark day in Australia's infrastructure development. It's the day when the two halves of the Trans-Australian Railway met in South Australia in the small town of Oldea, northwest of Adelaide. On the same day, the New South Wales Chief Engineer of Metropolitan Railway Construction, John Bradfield, was in Adelaide to deliver a paper to Australia's first town planning and housing conference. Bradfield is universally acknowledged for his work as an engineer, delivering the early 20th century mega projects. But we speak less these days about his expertise as a town planner and the vision he had for Sydney's growing population. Indeed, Bradfield was the founding member of the Town Planning Association of New South Wales in 1913. Like much of Bradfield's work, the paper he presented contained a vision for Sydney that was bold and ambitious. It showed Sydney tripling in size from 800,000 in 1916 to nearly 3 million by 1950. And as an aside, Sydney's population is expected to double that by 2041 at 6.1 million people. To anchor population growth, Bradfield proposes a city and suburban electric railway scheme, which he described as new railways constructed around the city and through the most densely populated suburbs. He then spoke about extensions off that main spur. Reflecting his skill as a town planner, Bradfield's paper integrates land use and population growth to ensure that any increase in population takes advantage of the government's existing investment in public transport. In Bradfield's plan, nearly half of Sydney's population was earmarked for higher density areas around Sydney's east, north and inner west, and just 15% was planned for the suburban fringe. In simple terms, he was saying, place people where there is public transport. Now, it's important to ask, is Sydney following the same template Bradfield laid down over 105 years ago? Consider the current plan to accommodate more than 1 million people in Sydney over the next 2 decades. Liverpool will take 80,000 additional people, Camden 88,000, the Hills over 100,000, Blacktown over 110,000 and Parramatta an additional 127,000 people. All of the local government areas I've just read out have public transport connections considered and rated in the bottom half of Sydney's suburbs. Meanwhile, North Sydney will take 8,700 people, Lane Cove 6,600, Woollahra 3,500 and my favourite is Mossman, which will take an additional 425 people over that same period of time, which is 21 people a year. And they've got their names and numbers. These are all local government areas with public transport connections rated in the bottom half of Sydney suburbs, in the top half of Sydney suburbs, I should say. Let me give you one example. Public transport access in North Sydney, Woollahra, Lane Cove and Mossman is rated 3 times better than public transport access in Camden. Yet the population growth projection for those suburbs is just 19,000 people, which is 70,000 less than what is planned for Camden alone. Now, this is a complete reversal of Bradfield's planning and transport principles. We are now locating the most people in the areas with the least public transport and the least amount of people in the areas with the best access to public transport. This is not planning to succeed, and we're concerned it's planning to fail. As Bradfield knew, and Sydney is now beginning to learn, the price of abandoning good planning principles is more than just traffic snarls and congestion or unhappy commuters. The cost is agreeing with the idea that big, growing communities should be without and indeed have a major deficit of major infrastructure. Now, the skewed plan for Sydney's growth is even more stark when you consider where public transport investment is being made. In the next 10 years, the vast majority of our infrastructure spending, some $65 billion, will be on the metro. And these are important additions to our public transport system, and I am not going to knock the Premier or his predecessors for this much-needed infrastructure. But for this huge price tag, the metro must support a sensible increase in new housing for families who want to live close to jobs and transport links. I'm worried we're again failing to align population growth with transport investment. Blacktown, an area with an additional 110,000 people, gets 2 metro stations, Tullawong and Rouse Hill. Travel east on the same line to Cherrybrook Metro Station in Hornsby, and the planned population increase is just 11,000 people, which is 1/10 of Blacktown's. Travel east a little further on the line and you get to North Sydney, which gets 2 metro stations, Crow's Nest and Victoria Cross. Yet only 8,700 additional people are planned in those areas for the next 2 decades. Plans for new homes above Crow's Nest Metro Station were dramatically reduced by the government, with 24 floors of additional housing earmarked for the site stopped dead in its tracks by the government due to opposition from local residents. When we do get an opportunity to deliver more affordable or key worker housing near metro stations, friends, we should take it. We can't pretend we don't need nurses, paramedics, police officers and teachers closer to the CBD. We do. And the metro provides the opportunities to build the housing for the future of Sydney. That's why Labor in government will change the Greater Cities Commission to rebalance population and housing growth as it sets its new housing targets on that metro line. Now, this is about fairness and equity. Population growth needs to be better planned and better matched to existing and future infrastructure, particularly public transport. Now, there's an argument that areas close to the city have already had density and therefore can't take any more. But that doesn't explain the planned population growth for Canterbury Bankstown. Now, this is an established area, it's on a metro line, but it will see 65,000 additional people, which is 7 times more than North Sydney. There's been much talk about local politics getting in the way of decent planning outcomes for our much-loved, fast-growing city. There are some that are insisting on virtually no increase in the number or population in their communities, while at the same time accepting billions in public funds to build new transport infrastructure. This is coming at the expense of Sydney's West, who are struggling to build a political consensus against a massive increase in population without the resulting infrastructure they need to support it. Now, the reason for this in part is, unsurprisingly, not enough people live out there yet. But one area that has seen that kind of growth is Gregory Hills, where 5,000 people have moved since 2016. The neighbouring suburb of Gledswoods Hills grew by an additional 6,000 people, so 5,000 people and 6,000 people, suburbs side by side. The demographic and composition of these communities is largely young families with young children, but there's not one public high school in either suburb. Young families that have moved there are angry, and they're demanding of the political leaders in New South Wales a fair bargain for their communities. So let's start by setting some proper housing targets in Sydney, especially around public transport assets. If elected in March, a New South Wales Labor government will introduce a target of 30% affordable, social and inclusive housing on surplus public land. We'll target transport land holdings, which are close to public transport hubs. We know some of the great cities in the world have higher affordable housing targets. London, for example, clocks in at 50%. But in New South Wales, historically, over governments of both political persuasions, we've celebrated targets of between 5 and 10%, And the bottom line is we have to do better. So rather than turning public land into hotels, we'll increase the supply of affordable housing for renters in locations best serviced by public transport. There's inequity in our planning system, but just as problematic is the confusion. Currently, there's 5 ministers and 13 government agencies planning Sydney. Meanwhile, DA processing times have blown out. This year, the average time is 99 days. It hasn't cracked 100 yet, but we're not at the end of the year. Last year, it was 83 days. So under Labor, all planning responsibilities other than for local government will sit squarely with the Minister for Planning. And that minister will be in charge of cutting red tape and streamlining what has become for many people frustrating, confusing and unworkable processes. And more worrying, a lot of that private capital is reorganising itself and going to other states and other jurisdictions precisely because of delays. In 2021, there are 54,000 first home buyers in New South Wales, but 48,000 of that 54 paid no stamp duty at all or paid a reduced amount. So the cohort that could potentially benefit from the new annual land tax scheme is tiny. It's less than 6,000. Now, it's clear to all what Labor's view about this new tax is. The Premier knows it. But even the most ardent supporters of the tax don't believe that it will fix the intergenerational crisis that we've got when it comes to home ownership for the next generation. So what will make a difference? Supply of housing for young home buyers is the best lever that we've got. Compared to the average salary, Sydney apartments are twice as expensive as they were a generation ago. And the deal, if you like, between a government and its youngest citizens was this. If you were born before 1980, you knew what you had to do. You're expected to get a job, work hard, pay rent, and then start saving. It was tough and sacrifices no doubt had to be made, but with a deposit and a steady job and capital growth on the asset, you could make it. Get your foot on the property ladder and you'd get ahead. Our job, the government's job, was to deliver a supply of housing to create neighbourhoods, parks, community infrastructure and public transport. But we know that that deal today is dead. And it's particularly gone for young people that live in Sydney. We can turn it around. Great cities don't just happen. They require skill and diligence and the discipline of a person like Bradfield. We can't sleepwalk into a sprawling disaster for Sydney where we just add one street to the western fringe of Sydney every other week. We can build a beautiful, balanced city with growth, develop momentum around well-built and designed neighbourhoods that give young buyers and renters an opportunity to own or live in the peace of the most beautiful city on earth. Premier Jack Lang recalls Bradfield as a dreamer with a, quote, conviction that he was planning the greatest city in the Southern Hemisphere. Our job is not just to claim Sydney as the most beautiful this side of the equator, but the most beautiful city in the world. Thank you.
You're just listening there to the New South Wales Opposition Leader Chris Minns addressing that Bradfield Oration live there in Sydney. We heard the different visions for the city from both of the political leaders in that state.